hope we can all agree that C.S. Lewis's novel, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, is hands down the best fiction novel in terms of depicting the heart of the gospel. Are we in agreement? Okay. But I love this book. I love the films. And one of my favorite scenes is when little Lucy has made her way to Narnia, and she's introduced to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. Now, Lucy finds herself down in the comfort of their burrow, and she's staying warm, enjoying her tea. And Mr. and Mrs. Beaver are starting to tell her about Narnia's king, Aslan. And as Mrs. Beaver starts to talk about how he's regal and royal and powerful and mighty, Lucy asks a question that I think any one of us would have asked in that moment. She asks, "But is he safe?" Well, Mr. Beaver scoffs and he says, "Safe? Of course he isn't safe. Who said anything about safe? But he's good. He's the king, I tell you." Well, welcome back to our Next Level series teaching on the book of Esther. Let's take a moment to review what we talked about last time before we jump into the text for today. So in chapter 1, we meet our king, Xerxes. He starts out as confident, wealthy, and successful, and he's throwing this banquet of epic proportions. But then he invites Queen Vashti to come and greet their guests. And when Vashti declines, we see Xerxes, in his drunken anger and under the advisement of his wise men, banishing the queen, which then leaves Xerxes lonely, embarrassed, and dare I say it, a little bit emasculated. Now, it's when we move into chapter 2 that a solution to his loneliness is offered. So let's go ahead and open up the text and take a look at some of these details. So when the curtains rise on chapter 2, we see this word later, or in some of your translations, maybe it's the phrase after these things. Now, this is an indication that some time has passed, but we don't know exactly how much time. However, a pretty good guess would be 2 to 3 years, and here's why. We know that Xerxes' rule began in 485. And then we know that the story of Esther starts in his 3rd year of his reign, when he has the banquet and he banishes Vashti. So that's 482-ish. And then when we get to Esther chapter 2, verse 16, we're going to find out it's in the 7th year of the king's reign that, well, spoiler alert, Esther's made queen. So we're going to say 479. But what's going on right here? What happened in the meantime? Well, what history books tell us is that Xerxes was off fighting a war against Greece, and he lost pretty badly. In fact, this humiliating defeat, combined with the fact that he pretty much depleted the Persian treasury, has him seriously discredited in the eyes of his subjects. Historian Herodotus describes the king's life after war as one of sensual overindulgence. Now, we knew Xerxes before. This is really saying something. Records indicate actually that he began to take whatever he wanted and whoever he wanted. And ultimately, it was his affairs with some of the wives of his own officers that got him assassinated in his own home in 465 BC. But I'm getting ahead of myself, I know. Let's go back to chapter 2, verse 1. So whether it was 2 years or 3 years or more, there's enough time that has passed between the banishing of Vashti and now that it seems like the king's anger against her is starting to subside. He's evaluating her crime up against his punishment, and he realizes there's nothing he can do to take it back. Because as his advisor Memucan said so clearly in chapter 1, the laws made by the king cannot be repealed. So it seems like Xerxes is no longer feeling merry. So his advisors take this clue and they concoct a plan. Find every most attractive girl in the kingdom and bring them here. And the girls will be prepped and they'll be dressed and they'll be paraded before the king, and he can take his pick. But I want to be really clear here. This is so much more than a beauty pageant. For starters, the girls brought to the palace, they didn't volunteer for this. They were taken from their families and their homes. Now, sure, some of them may have enjoyed the opulence of the palace, but most of them probably did not. Second, this is not how Persian kings of the past found their wives. In fact, Xerxes' own father, Darius, claimed his wives from other royal families. So even in Persian culture, this was pretty unheard of. Third, This 12-month beauty treatment that we see outlined in verse 12 and following, this was not a spa vacation that dreams are made of. It was probably more like a nightmare. These were customs that were typical of marriage preparation. But these young ladies know most of them are facing a fate more like widowhood. They know that every single one of them is going to lose their virginity to the king. But he's only going to choose one of them to be his wife. I mean, can you imagine the fighting and the plotting and the sabotage that have to be happening within that harem? And fourth, the women that are not chosen, they don't get to go back to their families and move on with their life. This is not the bachelor that we're talking about here. No, look at verse 14. Every one of these beautiful, vibrant young women, they're going to live out their days condemned to be forgotten concubines, just hoping that maybe one day the king will call for them again on a whim. This is terrifying. And it's ugly. But it is this ugliness that brings Esther to her royal position. So if you look at Esther, chapter 2, verse 5, we see both her and her cousin Mordecai introduced for the first time. And in terms of getting to know Mordecai, we're offered an interesting contrast here. We get a picture of his lineage, and specifically the name Kish might ring a bell. This was an ancestor of the Jewish king Saul. And so is the author letting us in on Mordecai's claim to a royal bloodline? Well, perhaps. But what difference does it make? He's here in exile with everyone else. So bloodline doesn't mean a whole lot at this point. But it's also here that we're told of Esther's adoption by her cousin Mordecai after her parents died. And in verse 7, it says, the girl Esther was beautiful in form and lovely to look at. In fact, just a fun fact, Jewish rabbis throughout generations have declared that Esther is one of the 4 most beautiful women in Scripture. The others being Sarah, Rahab, and Abigail. Well, Mordecai has raised Esther to be beautiful, but not just on the outside, on the inside too. And this is why it's no great surprise that as soon as she gets to the palace, she wins the favor of Hegai, the king's eunuch who was put in charge of all of the girls brought to the palace. Now, Hegai, having worked for the king, he knows what to look for in queen material. And clearly, Esther was a standout from the start. Because in verse 9, it says Esther not only got her beauty treatments like everyone else, but she also received choice foods, 7 attendants of her very own, and she was placed in the best apartment available. That's great, of course. But Mordecai knows the best case scenario for Esther is that she is chosen as the next queen of Persia. And so we see him coming by the palace gates every day to check on her. And we also see Mordecai advise Esther to keep her nationality and her family background a secret. Why? Well, on the one hand, the Jews were seen as less of a people, and they were kind of an unknown. They had a really checkered past because they'd been captives of so many different nations. And as far as family goes, she doesn't have one. She has no bloodline, and who wants that bred into the royal family? On the other hand, it's quite possible that Mordecai, holding some kind of position in the royal court, has already experienced mistreatment at the hands of Haman, which we're going to see more of in the next chapter. So it's possible that his instruction for Esther to keep her nationality a secret was actually to keep her physically safe in the midst of a harem that would have been primarily Persian. My best guess? It's probably a little bit of both. But what is Esther thinking about all of this? We're not given much detail about her personal feelings, but taken from her home, her cousin, her culture, her belief system, I imagine Esther is experiencing a whole gamut of emotions. She's probably feeling fear and anxiety and doubt, maybe shame. And I suppose it's possible that maybe she's feeling a little bit of hopefulness. But if she is, I bet she's feeling shame for feeling hopeful. This is a mess. And it's interesting that Esther is the only one of our main characters who's given 2 names in the actual narrative. Some writers wonder if the author wasn't pointing out her dilemma of having one foot in both worlds. On the one side, the Jewish world full of faith and turmoil, the world where she was raised. And on the other, the opulent world of the Persian court in which she was forced. Whatever the case, it seems that as much as she was able, Esther really did stay true to who she was. And so while all of the other girls embraced palace life with all of its material splendor, Esther, in her maturity, she not only listened to Mordecai regarding her identity, but she leaned in and she listened to the wisdom of the king's eunuch Haggai. And when it was her turn to go before the king, she presented herself in exactly the way she had been coached to do so. And she made the impression they all hoped for. Xerxes chose Esther to wear his royal crown. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm left with a rather strange feeling when we get to the end of verse 18. I mean, this is just not what we'd call a happy ending. It's kind of worded like one, but it feels so wrong. And I'm trying to remind myself again that just because I can't see God doesn't mean he's not present, but I'm going to be honest with you, he's getting harder and harder to find. I just feel such grief for all of these young women, and especially for Esther. I mean, we see her attempts at faithfulness in her obedience to Mordecai. We can observe her wisdom and discretion in placing her trust in Haggai and not letting herself get wrapped up in all of the royal hoopla. But the fact remains that in order to keep her identity a secret, she likely had to defy the Jewish law. She had to eat what the Persians ate. She had to act like the Persians acted, not to mention the fact that she went to bed with a man who was not her husband. And yes, I realize that she ended up marrying him, but he was a Gentile. And the prophet Ezra commanded all of the Jews to divorce their Gentile spouses when they came out of exile. So these factors cannot be ignored. What are we supposed to think about all this? I mean, are we just to accept that this was all a means to an end? Is this just what it is? I mean, is Esther just one tiny cog in the gigantic wheel of God's will? Are we? Well, the short answer is no. There's so much more of God to see here than just a man on a mission. So allow me to offer 3 truths, if you would. 3 truths for us to meditate on regarding the real king in this story. Number 1, only God knows the end of our story from the beginning. God is great, and his plans are great, and there are going to be moments that I cannot comprehend. But in those seasons when I can't see his divine plan, that does not give me permission to just throw in the towel. No, on the contrary, it is my responsibility to live as faithfully as I can in the situation that I find myself in, believing all the time the truth of Philippians chapter 1, verse 6, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion. Here's truth number 2. You can rest assured that God never compromises his holiness, and he never sighs at sin. Do not get it in your mind for a moment that Esther got away with her sin and got to be the hero of her story, and you can too. That is not what is happening here. No, the details of this night with the king are mysteriously ambiguous, and I think they're that way on purpose. We have been gifted this narrative, not so that we can make harsh assumptions or cast judgment, but so that we can learn a deeper and more desperate trust in our great God. And here's truth number 3. Our God is not just great. He's also good. Yes, the bigger story here is the salvation of the Jews, no question. But I don't think for a minute that Esther is just a means to an end. See, God, he cares deeply for every player in his story, and here's why I believe this. He could have orchestrated the salvation of the Jews in any way that he wanted, but he chose a palace. And the reason he chose this path is because he didn't just want the Jews to survive, he wanted them to thrive. And even in choosing this path for their salvation, he could have placed Esther where he needed her and then just let the details fall where they might. But he didn't do that. Esther was cared for. Esther was cared for by Mordecai. Esther was cared for by Haggai. Esther was cared for by Xerxes. Verse 17 shows us just how much God cares about the details. The NASB says the king loved Esther, that she found favor with him, and that he was kind to her. Xerxes, a man who maybe never loved or was kind to anyone else in his entire life. This is significant. The life of Esther mattered, and not just because the lives of the Jews mattered, because she mattered. And you matter too. Yes, our God is great, but he's also good. He's the king, I tell you. And as we explore more of this wild and winding story in the days to come, we're going to need to lean in to that goodness of our King. So until next time, rest in the truth that you are known, you are loved, and you are cared for.